This is Northwest Flight 188, an Airbus A320 flying from San Diego to Minneapolis on what should be a standard 4-hour flight. But for the last 80 minutes, air traffic control has been calling them without a response. Now, sometimes it happens while we're flying along that we get out of the range of the controllers when they're supposed to pass us on to another frequency, and we can't hear them anymore. There's a term for it when you've lost radio communications. We call it NORDO, which is technically no radio, which is not actually the right word for it. No radio is like the old planes that didn't have any radio. That was a NORDO. But we call it going NORDO when you lose radio communications. And what happens in that scenario is that somebody from a nearby plane will call you, and air traffic control will use that plane as a relay to get the message to you, or you can pick them up on a frequency which we monitor most of the time called guard. Something you'll typically notice when you get onto the flight deck of a commercial airliner is that they'll have this frequency in standby on the second radio, 121.5. Now technically when we're flying, we're supposed to be listening to two frequencies. One frequency is the one that we're communicating with air traffic control with, and this second frequency, guard, we use to monitor emergencies. If that's a thing, you can hear if there's been a plane crash, you'll hear an alarm going off, so you can relay that information to air traffic control, and then you can use it in case you get out of range of air traffic control. Now, what I do is I have the main frequency that I'm talking on up louder, and then I have guard, 121.5, up at like half volume. And the reason why I do that is so when I hear somebody talking to me, my aircraft, I can tell which frequency they're talking on. If it sounds at a normal frequency, I know they're talking to me on the number 1 radio. If it sounds kind of soft, I know it's on the number 2 radio, so I know where to reply to the person that's talking on. So that's a trick I learned back in the day, and I still use it now. Now that is what guard is supposed to be used for, but in the US, some pilots don't listen to it because on the radio, you'll hear people making cat noises like this.
You're on guard.
Now, I'm not the guard police. We actually have one airline that has self-designated themselves to monitor and police that frequency, but that is not my airline, so I don't have to do that. The guard frequency usually overseas, you will never hear people meowing or using it for any other reason. When you're crossing the ocean, you'll be able to monitor that frequency, and people will use it in some cases to find out what's going on with weather or things like that, but usually there's another frequency which we monitor for crossing the ocean. So that guard frequency, really you should just be listening to it in the case that you lose your radio or you're out of radio range or there's an emergency. That's what it's used for. But the controllers, regardless of where you're at, will be able to communicate to you on that frequency. If you're out of range of their normal radio, they can call and look on the screen of where you're at, call that controller, say, hey, come up on guard and call these guys and tell them to come up on your frequency. I wasn't able to pass them off to you. So the controllers would call you on guard. You would hear your call sign and go, oh, okay, they're looking for me. And that's how you're really never out of radio contact. But back here on Flight 188, these pilots obviously weren't listening to guard because air traffic control hasn't been able to reach them for over an hour. At the start of this audio, the flight attendants had just called to ask how long they were from landing. And that triggers them to make this call to air traffic control.
Minneapolis Northwest 188.
There's 188 Minneapolis Center. Go ahead.
Roger. We got that distracted. We have overflown Minneapolis. We are overhead to Eau Claire and would like to make a 180 and do arrival from Eau Claire.
There's 188, Roger. And turn to the right to heading a 100. There'll be radar vectors set you up there, holding there, and we'll see if we can't get you in.
Okay, copy. Right 180 to Eau Claire and expect holding at Eau Claire.
Well, you have to give them some credit for not being lost. One of the worst things that can happen to you as a pilot is lose your overall situational awareness, meaning you don't know where you're at in space, and these pilots obviously knew where they were at. And let me show you on the map. This is the great state of Minnesota, and they were aiming to go here in Minneapolis, but they're actually over here near Eau Claire. And since they were coming from the west, they overshot it a bit. Now, I don't know what the weather conditions are like, but one of the first things that comes to my mind when I hear you're going to have to hold, which he says right here.
There's 188, Roger. And turn to the right to heading a 100. There'll be radar vectors set you up there, holding there, and we'll see if we can't get you in.
But they've overflown their destination, and now they have to hold. So my first thought is going to be fuel. How much fuel do I need in order to safely get on the ground, and what's the weather like, which I don't really know because this was a long time ago. Of course, these controllers are going to wonder what's been going on with these pilots, so here they're going to follow up and find out what happened.
And Northwest 188 pilot heading a 100 via radar vectors for your descent also. And you are clear to Minneapolis via radar vectors heading 100 for clear and then clear 8 arrival.
Okay, copy. 100 to pick up the Eau Claire 8 arrival Northwest 188.
Northwest 188 center, wants you up on 3375.
Okay, we'll come up on 3375.
And Northwest 188. No, stay right here. 123.72. 2372 for now, and I'll have you over that arrival sector here in just a moment. You can stay right here, and on this frequency, and I just have to verify that cockpit is secure.
It is secure. We got distracted. We were...
Northwest 188, Roger.
Remember how I talked about earlier, sometimes air traffic control will use a group of pilots to relay a message to another plane because they think they're out of range and that's why they're not hearing them. I think that's what happened when this female pilot checked in with them.
Northwest 188 center, wants you up on 3375.
Of course, these controllers are asking if the pilots are okay, if they're in control of the aircraft, because this is after 9/11, so they need to make sure that everything's okay. In a lot of cases, if you've not talked to air traffic control for that long of a period of time, fighter jets are going to get sent up in the air to come look and see what's going on, what's happening, is the plane safe, are the pilots awake? And they're going to do some things to wake the pilots up, and they're going to call them, and they have their own procedures of things they're going to do, which I'm not going to talk about in this video, but they're going to make sure the pilots, if they are sleeping, wake up. So if you ever look out your window and see something like a fighter jet flying outside, it's possible your pilots fell asleep. However, if the pilots were to lose their radios and are out of radio contact because their radio, let's say they spilt something on it and their radio stopped working, which has happened, we do have a way to transmit to air traffic control, hey, everything is fine, but our radio's not working, and they can see exactly what we're doing and everything, and they'll know from that code that we set up, hey, everything's fine with the plane, but they're having some radio issues, and that's totally fine. That's not a big deal at all. But these pilots did neither of those things. They said they were distracted.
It is secure. We got distracted. We were...
Of course, air traffic control is not just going to take, oh, you were distracted for the last hour and a half. Like, that's a long time. To put it in perspective, let's say 5 to 10 minutes, that could happen all the time. You could be thinking you're on a frequency, you've gotten a handoff from somebody else, you can still hear people talking on the radio, but no one had said your name, so you just kind of ignored it. That happens. 5 or 10 minutes, that's not a big deal. 15 would be a little bit long. If it gets longer than 20 and you don't hear anybody talking about anything and you haven't heard your call sign come up on the guard frequency, a lot of times what pilots will do is they'll just key up the mic and say like, anyone there? And the controllers will say, yeah, we're still here, it's just quiet. And we're doing that because we think, man, maybe we lost contact or something's wrong because it's just so quiet. During COVID, it was like that. We were flying around, just be one of the only planes in the sky, and we're flying around and you don't hear anything. It was really eerie, but a lot of times guys would key up on the frequency and go like, still there? Because it's weird. So you want to make sure you're still in radio contact. So that's what will happen after a while. But after an hour, if you haven't heard your call sign, you know there's been a problem. Here's what happens next.
Minneapolis Northwest 188 to with you at a 356 for 320.
Northwest 188, Minneapolis, Director. How much fuel do you have left?
We got plenty of fuel.
Northwest 188, do you have time to give a brief explanation on what happened?
Just cockpit distraction, that's all I can say.
Northwest 188, Roger. Northwest 188, is there any way you can elaborate on the distraction?
We're just dealing with some company issues here, and that's all it was. That's all I can say right now at this time.
Northwest 188, Roger.
I'm guessing air traffic control keeps asking them about what's going on, hoping that these pilots are going to hang themselves, probably because the military and some of the big bosses up in the FAA are telling these controllers, find out what was actually going on. Normally, they're not going to be asking you those types of questions unless you have an emergency or a fire, and they don't have that situation. They may also just be trying to verify that these pilots are actually the pilots and not somebody that has bad intention. I don't know. But these pilots are being smart, if you will, about not hanging themselves. There is a cockpit voice recorder, as most of you will know, and that cockpit voice recorder records everything. However, it records over itself. It's used in the case of an accident. So it will keep recording until there's some type of an impact. This plane landed safely so that there was no impact, nobody died. But when that impact, that's when it stops recording. So it will keep recording over itself so they know The longer the flight is, the easier everything's going to be because there won't be any information on the cockpit voice recorder. And most pilots know this rule buried very deep in the rule books on page 764. Information obtained from the record is used to assist in determining the cause of accidents or occurrences in connection with the investigation under Part 830. The administrator does not use the cockpit voice recorder record in any civil penalty or certificate action. Essentially what that means is if you're talking badly about your boss and it's caught on that recording, they can't use that in any way to penalize you. That's basically what it comes down to. However, the FAA doesn't really care because at the end of the day, they can do whatever they want. And if you're not flying the plane safely, it doesn't matter what the cockpit voice recorder says. You haven't checked in for an hour and a half. And that's what's happening with these guys. They're trying to get that information because now you haven't talked on the radio for a while. Everybody's involved and you got a lot of attention on you, and you don't want to be flying with everybody paying a lot of attention to you and who you are and what's going on. You want to be under the radar. You want to do your whole career and have nobody know who you are. That's the key. So these pilots said they weren't doing this, sleeping. They said they were working on their schedules. Now in some countries, pilots are allowed to take controlled rest. They don't call it naps or sleeping, they just call it controlled rest. But the FAA doesn't allow that. I think that being a guy that does a lot of long haul and flying in the backside of the clock in the middle of the night, getting an extra 15 or 20 minutes of rest while you're there in the seat makes sense to me as long as the other person is there and awake and stays awake, and there have been some recent changes to mitigate these risks. Everything in aviation, what we do is we look at, hey, this is a risk, and flying all night is a risk, even though this flight was not all night, but flying all night for me is definitely a risk. So we have things that are set up in place to prevent that risk from becoming a real big problem, like sleeping for 80 minutes. This FAA document says, although a number of foreign air carriers authorize in-seat cockpit naps during the flight, the FAA does not authorize such in-seat cockpit naps. Now, the interesting thing to keep in mind with this is they don't want someone up there while the other person isn't there to monitor them. However, on a freighter, if I'm sitting in the seat there by myself while the other pilot gets up, goes to the bathroom, puts a food in, starts doing the coffee, they could be gone for 10 or 15 minutes and I'm just up there doing all this stuff by myself while that person is doing all those other things, going to the bathroom, getting some food, making some coffee. That could easily take 10 or 15 minutes. So is there a real difference between that and me sleeping there for 15 minutes or them sleeping there for 15 minutes, which would help them be more alert and more awake and be safe while they're flying? No, I don't really think so. However, I don't get to make the rules. I'm just out there flying the jet. So those are the rules that we have to follow until the FAA says, hey, we now think cockpit naps or whatever they call them are okay, so you can do it. In that case, you can do it. And what's funny is earlier in that exact same document, they say it's beneficial for restoring both performance and alert levels, especially during long periods of wakefulness. But rules are rules, so you don't do it. What I do is I turn on all the lights that are on the flight deck at night. I turn on all the lights so that way it's nice and bright and it makes it not a sleeping environment. I have had people where what they do is they dim all the lights and they get it real dark, and then they'll turn the heat up and get it all warm. And I say, like, look, man, I'm like a glass of milk and a cookie away from just being useless to you and sleeping for the next 4 hours. So I say, if you want to make it all dim, that's fine. But if you're going to hear me sleeping in like 10 minutes. So then they'll turn on the lights and turn up everything bright. It's just, that's just not going to work for me. You can't make everything dim in the middle of the night while I'm tired and then go like, oh yeah, this is so nice. That's never going to work. And I think that's dumb. So I mitigate that risk by turning all the lights on, and that helps me to stay awake. The other thing is they have this crew alerting system now, whereas if you're not touching anything, if you're not turning on the radio or touching something on the control panel, if you're not doing any of those things after a certain amount of time, you get a message and it looks like this. Once we see this, we have just a few minutes to respond. If we don't respond within a few minutes, then it turns into something like a fire alarm noise, and I had some pilots once do that. I was in the galley just making food. I was on break, but they just wanted to see what would happen, and they took it to that fire alarm noise, and I came running up there, and my heart was just racing because I thought something really bad has happened because we're in cruise over the ocean. And they were just like, oh yeah, we saw the new thing. We just wanted to see what happened, which is kind of what pilots do. So they just wanted to see what was going to happen. So now the planes have mitigated the risk with that. So between lights and just knowing how to handle your rest thing. Now the manufacturers have put this in there so that way pilots, if they do fall asleep, which look, it's human, you could have an 8-hour flight, it could be just 2 people, you could be doing it over the middle of the night across the ocean, nobody's talking to you. It can happen. And if you don't respond and you both happen to fall asleep, which would obviously be a problem, then you have your plane will wake you up. So there's just a mitigation of the risk that way as well. Now, according to this report, both pilots ended up getting their licenses removed, which means the airline can't keep them there as pilots. And truthfully, it's kind of sad because I'm sure these pilots have probably had a very good career and they've maybe never made any mistakes, but that's one of the things about being a pilot. They don't let you make any mistakes. You make one big mistake and that's it. And that's the way it works in the world of being a pilot. There's a lot of glory, but there's a lot of pressure as well. If you do something stupid like fall asleep, even though it was just an honest mistake, and I'm not saying that these pilots fell asleep, but they didn't respond for 80 minutes. So whatever it was that they were doing, they could have been watching a movie and totally been having a great time up there, but you're not doing what you were supposed to be doing, which was flying the plane. So regardless of whatever it is, you made one mistake, and sometimes one mistake is all it takes, and everything's over for your career. Pilots can, after that, then go reapply, get their licenses, and try to get hired by another airline, and they can go through this big process. It's happened. I know a guy that happened to. They lost all their licenses because they made a pretty big mistake. They had to go redo all their licenses and then reapply. This happened in 2009 and 2009, 10, 11, no airlines were hiring. It was a terrible time in aviation, really hard to get a job. So having something like that on your record when there's thousands of pilots literally fighting for every single job, then these guys are going to have a really hard time getting a job really anywhere for a few more years. Probably about 2016 it started to pick up, and obviously now it's crazy. So if you ever do look out your window and you see a bunch of fighter jets flying with your plane, your pilots probably aren't asleep, but you are part of an air show. I look forward to hearing from you. Until then, keep the blue side up.